In this video, we're going to talk about the ancestors from the Owens Smith family that lived in England. This is by no means all the ancestors, it's just a few of those that I thought had interesting stories. The one we're going to start with will be about our 12th great grandparents. You have to understand that when you go to your 12th great grandparents, there's 16,384 people in that generation. When you go to the 15th great grandparents, there's over 131,000 people in the generation. And then when you get out to the 20th grandparent, there's over 4 million people just in that generation. Obviously, I've only documented a small fraction of this amount of people in our family tree, but I want you to understand that all the people that are listed here on this video have a documented lineage back to our grandparents, Wesley and Winnie Owens. The first ancestor I want to talk about is actually not even English. She is Italian. Talking about our 12th great grandmother, Camilla Darcy. I'm not even going to try and pronounce her Italian name, her maiden name. Camilla was born in 1562 in Florence, Italy. She's actually started a branch of the Owens family that's from Florence. At some unknown time, Camilla came to England, and then in 1583 she married an Englishman, Thomas Darcy. Camilla and Thomas lived the rest of their lives in England, and her family got to America when her great grandson, John Edward Van, immigrated from England to Virginia in 1666. The next ancestor I want to talk about is our 11th great grandfather, Bishop Richard Vaughan. Richard was born in 1550 in Wales. In his early life, he was educated for the ministry at St. John's College in Cambridge. He eventually graduated with a Doctor of Divinity in 1589. During his life, he was either the rector or the bishop of several different churches in England, and he eventually became the Bishop of London from 1604 until his death in 1607. He is buried at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. During his life, he helped translate the Bible into Welsh. Interestingly enough, Richard is the 9th great grandfather of singer Judy Garland, and he is also the 9th great grandson of King Edward I of England. Our next ancestor that I want to talk about is our 13th great grandfather, Sir Thomas Bromley. Thomas was educated at Oxford University, and after he graduated, he was called to the bar. During his life, he became an accomplished jurist in England and served in numerous government positions having to do with the law. In 1579, Thomas was appointed Lord Chancellor of England, which is the head of the British judiciary. As a result of having that position, he was required to preside over the trial of Mary, Queen of Scots, for treason in 1586. Unfortunately, the strain of the trial and the responsibility of ordering the execution of a monarch proved too much for him, and he died soon after the trial. He is buried in Westminster Abbey. The next item I want to talk about is not a person, but an event. It's an event called the Field of Cloth of Gold. What this was a 3-week-long summit in the June of 1520. It took place in northwest France between Henry VIII, the King of England, and Francis I, the King of France. The purpose of the summit was basically so Francis could try and convince Henry to join his conflict against the Holy Roman Empire. The tournament consisted of a bunch of fancy tents and clothes and huge feasts, music, jousting, and games, things like that. The participants displayed so much cloth of gold, which was an expensive fabric that was woven with silk and gold, that's what gave the event its name. There was a number of our ancestors that attended the event with Henry VIII. They're listed here. The event was very impressive, but it didn't really accomplish very much. Relations between the two countries quickly soured, and it was not long before they were back at war with each other. The next ancestor is our 13th great grandfather, Reverend John Fox. John was a prominent English clergyman and author. He wrote a book called the Book of Martyrs. This book was a graphic account of people who had suffered for the cause of Protestantism, primarily from the 14th century through the reign of Queen Mary I. Queen Mary was the daughter of Henry VIII, and she was a staunch Catholic. During her reign, she enthusiastically prosecuted and executed Protestants. She got the name Bloody Mary. The book that John wrote was widely read at the time and often the most valuable book in Protestants' household besides the Bible. When Mary became queen, he fled to Strasbourg, France, and then Basel, Switzerland, where he completed the book in Latin. Um, when Mary's sister, Elizabeth I, became queen, he returned to London, where he finished the book and it was published in English. Now let's talk about a ancestor named Thomas Wyatt. Thomas was our 14th great grandfather. He was a politician in England who led a rebellion against Queen Mary I, which is typically referred to as Wyatt's Rebellion. When Thomas was a child, he lived in Spain with his parents. While there, he witnessed the atrocities done during the Spanish Inquisition, and as a result, um, had an aversion to the Spanish government. When Thomas learned of Queen Mary's decision to marry Philip of Spain, he was strongly opposed to the marriage. As a result, he raised an army and led them in an attempt to intercept the landing of King Philip when he came to England. His forces were cut off by the forces of Queen Mary. Thomas was taken prisoner, quickly found guilty of treason, and beheaded. His head was hung from the gallows, and his limbs were cut from his body, and they were circulated among the various towns to show Queen Mary's power. Thomas the Younger's parents were Thomas Wyatt and Elizabeth Brooke. Thomas the elder was an English politician, ambassador, and poet. He's credited with introducing the sonnet to English literature. Thomas and Elizabeth were married in 1521, but then they separated in 1525 based on Elizabeth's adultery. Around this same time, many historians believe that Thomas developed a romantic interest in Anne Boleyn, which this was before she became the second wife of Henry VIII. Some actually believe he had an affair with her and wrote several poems about her. During his lifetime, he was held in prison several times, but each time he was released. In 1536, he was arrested and held in the Tower of London for having an affair with Anne Boleyn. Many historians believe this was just an excuse to incriminate Anne. While he was in the Tower of London, he witnessed Anne's execution. After Elizabeth separated from Thomas in 1525, she lived openly in adultery with another man. In 1541, Henry VIII, for some reason, forced them to reconcile, but Thomas died shortly after this. After the death of Henry VIII's fifth wife, Catherine Howard, he held a dinner party. It was said that during the party he paid special attention to Elizabeth and another woman. Some people even thought that Elizabeth was a possible choice for Henry's sixth wife. She ultimately married Sir Edward Warner, who was the lieutenant of the Tower of London. She died at the Tower of London and is buried there. The next person is our 11th great grandfather, Armagil Wade. Armagil was an English politician that served in the court of both Henry VIII and Edward VI. What's interesting about Armagil is that he was also an explorer. He was part of the crew of the first English expedition that reached North America. In 1536, he was part of the crew of the Minion that left Gravesend, England, and took 2 months and eventually landed or reached Cape Breton, Canada. They also visited Newfoundland. After this, they returned to England. Armagil's son later described him as the first English explorer to reach North America and said he was the English Columbus. Most historians describe this as a extreme over-exaggeration and that he was just part of the expedition. In fact, he wasn't even the leader of the expedition. On a totally unrelated note, Armagil and his wife had 17 children, and unfortunately 11 of them died before they did. Our next ancestor is our 14th great grandfather, Adrian Fortescue. Adrian was knighted in 1503. In both 1513 and 1523, he fought in England's wars against France. During his life, he was an officer of the court for Henry VIII and even accompanied him to the Field of Cloth of Gold in 1520. In 1539, Adrian, along with others, was arrested and condemned for treason without trial. There was no reason given for his arrest, but historians believe it was related to Adrian's opposition to Henry VIII's policies against the Catholic Church. After he was convicted, he was taken to the Tower of London and he was executed by being beheaded. Interestingly, his servants were also executed after the trial. In 1895, Adrian was made a saint by Pope Leo XIII as a martyr for the Catholic Church. The next thing I'd like to talk about is a very significant event that happened in the history of England called the War of the Roses. The War of the Roses took place between 1455 and 1487. What it was a series of battles fought over control of the English throne. It was fought between supporters of two rival branches of the royal house of Plantagenet, the House of Lancaster and the House of York. The War of the Roses took its name from the fact that the symbol of the House of Lancaster was the red rose, and the symbol of the House of York was the white rose. Both sides ruled England at various times during the war based on who had won the most recent battle. Um, Ultimately, the war extinguished the male lines of both dynasties. At the end of the war, the houses of Lancaster and York were united, creating a new royal dynasty, the Tudor family, which at the time was ruled by Henry VII. The reason this event is significant for this presentation is because numerous of our ancestors fought on both sides of the conflict, and several of them were killed in battle. There's also a couple other things involving our ancestors in regard to the War of the Roses that I'd also like to talk about. The first one involves our 15th great grandfather, Richard Croft. Um, Richard was a royal officer who served during the reign for several different kings. And during the War of the Roses, he followed the House of York. He fought during several battles during the war. In 1461, he fought at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross, which was actually fought on his own estate. In 1471, he fought at the Battle of Tewkesbury, which was a decisive Yorkist victory. During the battle, he's the one that actually captured the son of King Henry VI, Prince Edward. Prince Edward was subsequently executed. In 1487, Richard also fought in what was probably the last battle of the War of the Roses, the Battle of Stoke. It's interesting, he would have been 60 years old during this final battle. Another item I would like to mention is how the War of the Roses might have impacted the life of our 15th great grandmother, Elizabeth Devereux Corbett. On the 22nd of August in 1485, there was a battle fought called the Battle of Bosworth Field. Fighting on the side of the House of Lancaster was Elizabeth's husband, Richard Corbett. Fighting on the opposite side for the House of the Yorkists was Elizabeth's father, Walter Devereux. Unfortunately, during the battle, Walter was killed, and he was subsequently buried in the battlefield grave pits near the battle site. I always wondered how this would have impacted Elizabeth the rest of her life. For a little historical perspective, the Battle of Bosworth Field was one of the last significant battles of the War of the Roses. It was won by the Lancastrians, who were led by Henry Tudor, who went on to become King Henry VII. The Yorkists were led by King Richard III, who was killed during the battle. He was the last English monarch who was actually killed in battle. This battle, along with another Lancastrian victory at the Battle of Stoke in 1487, marked the end of the Plantagenet dynasty and the beginning of the Tudor dynasty. The last ancestor I want to talk about in relation to the War of the Roses is our 16th great grandfather, Henry Wyatt. Henry is the father and the grandfather of the two Thomas Wyatts that I talked about earlier. As a young man during the War of the Roses, he followed the House of Lancaster. In 1483, he was involved in a failed revolt against the then King Richard III. As a result, he was thrown in prison in the Tower of London and tortured. Legend has it that he survived his imprisonment only because of a cat that brought him birds to eat and kept him warm by sleeping on him. When Richard was defeated in 1485 at the Battle of Bosworth Field, the new king, Henry VII, released Henry from prison. He served Henry VII and his son Henry VIII in various positions until 1528 when he retired. Our next ancestor is our 16th great grandfather, Richard Guildford. Richard was an English courtier who held many important positions at the court of King Henry VII. Um, he was knighted in 1497 for his contribution in defeating the Cornish rebels at the Battle of Blackheath. What I find interesting about Richard is in 1506 he made a pilgrimage to the Holy Lands. In fact, he got all the way to Jerusalem. Unfortunately, once he got there, he fell ill and he died. He was buried in the Crusaders Cemetery there in Jerusalem. Our next ancestor is John Conyers. John was our 15th great grandfather. What's interesting about John is a number of sources credit him with being the person behind the mythical English legend of Robin Hood. During John's life, there was a person referred to as Robin of Redsdale who was helping with a local rebellion against a local ruler. What these sources base this information on is at the time there was some writings that said nobody knew who Robin was, but it could have been Sir John Conyers or his brother William Conyers. Obviously, nobody knows for sure if this is true or not. The next ancestor is our 16th great grandmother, Elizabeth Cheney Say. What's interesting about Elizabeth is that by dint of her two marriages, one of which was to our 16th great grandfather, John Say, she was the great grandmother of Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, and Catherine Howard. These women were three out of the six wives of King Henry VIII of England. The next item I want to talk about is not a person, but again, another event. The event I'm referring to is the Battle of Agincourt. Um, this battle was a famous battle during the Hundred Years' War when King Henry V of England invaded France. The battle took place on 25 October 1415 in northwest France near the small village of Agincourt. It was a decisive victory for the English, despite being significantly outnumbered by the French. The victory boosted English morale, crippled France, and started a period of English dominance in the war. Interestingly, the battle was depicted in the climactic battle scene of the 2019 movie The King. And as a side note, as you might expect, the whole movie, while entertaining, does not really follow the facts of Henry's life and the battle. The significance of this event is that numerous of our ancestors fought in that battle, and they're listed here. The next ancestors are our 16th great grandparents, Geoffrey Boleyn and Anne Hoo Boleyn. Geoffrey moved to London when he was a young man and became a hat maker. He eventually worked hard and became a wealthy cloth merchant. During that time, he was also the master of the Mercer's Company, which was a prominent cloth merchant guild. During his life, he was elected Sheriff of London. He was a member of Parliament from London. And in 1457, he was the Lord Mayor of London. He was also knighted by King Henry VI. What makes them interesting, as you might imagine from the name, Geoffrey and Anne were the great grandparents of Queen Anne Boleyn, who was the second wife of King Henry VIII. And by extension, they were the great great grandparents of Henry and Anne's daughter, Queen Elizabeth I. The next ancestors I want to talk about is another of our 16th great grandparents, William Neville, and his wife Joan Falkenberg. William, William was the great grandson of King Edward III of England. He was a nobleman and an accomplished soldier. During his life, he fought in numerous conflicts, including the latter half of the Hundred Years' War. He served in France in the 1430s and the early 1440s. In 1449, he was back in France where he was captured in Normandy. He was held captive in France until 1453 when he was ransomed and returned to England. And he also fought in the early part of the War of the Roses with his brother-in-law Richard, the Duke of York. And finally, in 1462, he was appointed a Lord Admiral. What I find curious about Joan is that from birth, she was considered, and I quote, an idiot. Despite this, before she was 16 years old, she married William. During their married life, they had 3 kids together, including our 15th great grandmother, Alice Neville. When William died, Joan didn't get to inherit any lands because she was considered of being of unsound mind. As we continue back in our family tree, the next ancestor I want to talk about is our 18th great grandfather, Richard Waller. At 20 years old, Richard fought in the Battle of Agincourt with Henry V. During the battle, he was the person who actually captured the commander of the French forces, Prince Charles, Duke of Orleans, who incidentally was also the father of a future king of France. After he was captured, Charles was held for ransom and taken to England. While he was in England, Richard was actually put in charge of Charles, and he held Charles captive in his home for over 20 years. The reason why Charles was held as a prisoner for so long was because at that time there was this huge power struggle in France to determine who the new king was. Charles was just one more claimant to the throne, so the powers that be in France were in no hurry to bring him back, to just confuse the situation even more. While Charles was held as a prisoner by Richard Waller, you have to understand that he lived a very comfortable life and moved around from castle to castle, even went to London a couple times. In fact, Richard and Charles became long-lasting friends during this captivity. Our next ancestor is our 16th great-grandfather, James Andrews. James was a lawyer and a landowner in Ipswich, England. For the 20 years prior to his death, he represented the Duke of Norfolk in the litigation over a land dispute. During this case, the other party involved threatened the Duke. As a result, the court at the time ordered all parties to appear and try and resolve the dispute. Unfortunately, the day before the court appearance was scheduled, James was attacked and murdered. For some reason, James' family appealed to the Earl of Suffolk for protection. For the next few months, there was this ongoing dispute developed between the Duke and the Earl, which resulted in a threat of large-scale violence. This dispute got so bad that eventually the King's council had to step in and intervene and try and settle the dispute and try and figure out what happened. Unfortunately, in the end, most of the people involved were given royal pardons, and we don't really know what the outcome was. Our next ancestor is a guy named John Bryan. John was our 16th great grandfather. Turns out John was kind of an ornery fella. Around 1415, his mother accused him of kidnapping her and forcing her to sign over her rights to him to her estate. Apparently it worked, because when she died, John got all of her property. There was another incident where a local church official insulted one of John's in-laws. The in-laws called on John for help, and what John did was raise a group of armed men who went over and besieged the church official's home and vandalized the church. Another thing, in 1437, John was appointed sheriff of Lancaster. This appointment supposedly was for life. In 1446, a council in Lancaster was set up to examine charges of malfeasance that were brought against John. The council did their investigation, and they determined that John had used his position as sheriff to help procure false indictments against several of his enemies. Although John was allowed to retain his office, he was no longer allowed to perform his official duties as sheriff. So it turns out that John Bryan was kind of an unethical guy. Our next ancestor is our 16th great grandfather, Richard Norton. What's interesting about Richard is that from 1413 to 1420, he was the Chief Justice of the Common Pleas. The Chief Justice of the Common Pleas at the time was the head of the Court of Common Pleas, also known as the Common Bench or Commonplace, which at the time was the second highest common law court in the English legal system. In 1875, the Court of Common Pleas was combined with other courts, and as such, the Chief Justice of the Common Pleas was one of the highest judicial officials in England, behind only the Lord High Chancellor and the Lord Chief Justice of England. At this point, it might be beneficial for me to explain why so many of the people I've talked about in this video are 16th great grandparents. The reason is, when I made the video of the branches of the Owens family that I've been able to trace, and there's a lot of them that stopped and I can't trace them, but the ones I have been able to follow, I've taken them out to the 16th great grandparents. I've got some more information. There's more people, and those are just interesting branches that I continue to follow. And as I explained at the start of the video, when you get out to the 16th great grandparents, there's over 130,000 people just in that generation. So there's a lot of people. As I continue to follow the branches of the tree further out, I'm sure I'm going to run into a lot more interesting people and interesting ancestors. The next ancestor I want to talk about is not even English. He's actually a Welshman. His name is Owain Glyndwr, and I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that even remotely correctly. He was our 18th great grandfather. and he was the last native-born Welshman to hold the title of Prince of Wales. He remains a notable figure in the culture of Wales. In fact, he was portrayed in Shakespeare's play Henry IV, Part 1, as the character Owen Glendower. What makes Owen so fascinating is that in 1400 he started a long running revolt against the English rule of Wales. By using guerrilla tactics, by 1404 he controlled pretty much all of Wales. However, using its superior resources, by 1407 England had turned the tide of the conflict, and by 1409 they had reconquered most of Wales. At that point, Owain retreated to the Welsh wilderness and continued to fight using guerrilla tactics. Um, the last sighting of him was in 1412 when he attacked and captured a leading supporter of King Henry. Um, Twice he ignored offers of a pardon from King Henry V, and despite large rewards offered for his capture, he was never betrayed by the people of Wales, and he was never captured. His death is estimated to be sometime around 1415. Our next ancestor is our 20th great grandfather, John Hawkwood. What's interesting about John is that he spent most of his adult life as a mercenary. Um, he first served in the English Army in the very early stages of the Hundred Years' War, and after that he joined a small mercenary company that fought in France. By the 1360s, John had risen to be the commander of a unit of mercenaries called the White Company, and he spent the next 30 years fighting for money in Italy. The White Company was a group of mostly English and German mercenaries that fought in Italy. Um, During the time that John was the commander, the White Company fought under many different banners and switched sides many times. While doing so, John became a rich man, and by the 1390s he was the commander of the army for the city-state of Florence. Florence eventually made him a citizen, and he spent the latter years of his life living in a villa near Florence. When he died in 1394, he was buried with state honors in a cathedral in Florence. Shortly after his burial, English King Richard III asked that his body be returned to England, which it was, and he was buried in Essex. Our next ancestor is our 18th great grandfather, John de Grey. During his lifetime, John was an accomplished soldier. During the 1300s, he fought in numerous of England's conflicts. In 1336, he fought in Scotland. In 1342, he fought in Flanders. During the 1340s, he fought in France numerous times, and he fought in France again in 1356. Also in 1356, he was one of the witnesses to the charter where Edward Balliol granted all the rights of Scotland to the English King Edward III. What makes John interesting is that he was one of the founding members of the most noble order of the Garter, which is also known as Knights of the Garter. This order was founded in 1348 by King Edward III. The order is the most senior order of knighthood in the British honor system. It's outranked in precedence only by the Victoria Cross and the George Cross. Members of the Knight of the Garter are limited to the English sovereign, the Prince of Wales, and 24 living members. The last ancestor I want to talk about is our 19th great grandfather, Adam Banastray. Adam was a knight and a landowner in Lancashire, England. Adam and several other knights were upset with the Earl of Lancaster because they felt a rival knight named Sir Robert de Holland was getting preferential treatment over them. As a result, in 1315, Adam and the other knights started a rebellion against de Holland, referred to as Banastre's Rebellion. On 8 October 1315, Adam and the others started rampaging through the countryside. They stole and ransacked property of supporters of de Holland, and eventually they end up killing a supporter of his named Edward de Bury. Um, as a result, the deputy sheriff of Lancashire organized a force of several hundred locals and went in pursuit of Banastre's group. Banastre's group was eventually located and quickly routed in a pitched battle. Banastre escaped but was eventually located and was summarily executed by being beheaded. I have one last thing I want to talk about in this presentation. Probably the most fascinating thing for me that I have discovered during my research of our family tree is that I found at least 7 husbands and wives, couples, who are the great grandparents of both my mother and my father. So the people that you see on this list, they are related to me through both my mother and my father, which I consider amazing.